Doctors who have been in an "is anybody here a doctor?" situation, what happened? My wife and I were waiting for a plane to take off, and someone asked for a doc over the intercom. My wife got up, and there was this guy lying in the aisle, already dead. She couldn't do anything, had to sign some forms, and they got the guy off the plane and made an announcement that the guy was in a stable condition. Which is technically true for some definition of the word stable. I had a guy die next to me on a plane. They put the oxygen mask on him and pretended he was stable. He was a really large guy, and they discussed what to do when we landed. Decided it would be too hard to get him down the aisle with everybody on board, so they emptied the plane first. That's pretty horrifying and sad. Not a doctor, but I was on a flight from DC to Chicago and got so sick I passed out upon landing. As I was coming to, I was being aided by a man and heard another person shout, "Are you a doctor?" The man helping me replied, "I'm the Surgeon General of the United States." This was Vivek Murthy, and it happened around 2015. He was the kindest and humblest guy. "Are you a doctor?" "I am the doctor." I'm currently a first-year resident, internal medicine in Sweden. This happened last year, about a year after I graduated, so I was still relatively fresh out of med school. I was flying home from my vacation from the Mediterranean, a 3-hour flight, when they announced on the speaker system that they were looking for a healthcare professional. Stood up when they called out a second time, maybe 15 seconds later. It was me and a slightly older nurse who went up to the front rows, where a middle-aged male was awake but unresponsive. As I didn't really have a lot of experience and was somewhat panicking, kept the panic internally to myself, it's scary being alone, I fell back to ATLS and eventually noticed that I had a D problem. Decreased strength in one of his arms and one-sided facial droop that was quite mild. Long story short, I suspected a stroke but couldn't really do a whole lot. We were 30 minutes away from landing at the time of the initial call. They didn't deviate or anything. I didn't feel like I did that much, to be honest, except to say that I suspected a stroke and asked if they could call an ambulance to the airport. The airplane seemed to land a bit faster than it usually does, and as we went off the runway there was an ambulance waiting off the taxiway. When the ambulance staff boarded the plane, I gave a short report, and that's basically it. I got a thank you from the relatives and the stewardesses. They asked me to write down my name and email, but I haven't heard anything since. I used to work as a flight attendant, and thank you for making yourself known. It's always a support, no matter how little you feel you've done. We just get the basic training, depending on the airline, a little more or less. So it was always a godsend to me. Even when nothing happened, I always appreciated when doctors made themselves known during boarding. Our airline even has a doctor on board program where you enroll, show up on the passenger list and earn some miles. An eternal gratitude from the flight attendants. As for stroke, my basic training taught me there's not really much you can do on board except for a diversion or immediate landing. Since you were that close to the next airport, there was indeed not much you could do, but I'm sure the crew appreciated you being there. Thank you again for what you do. Just so that everyone has heard it once, we have a liability disclaimer, which means you're legally protected against compensation claims. As long as you're not acting with a clear intent to kill the person, that is. Skilled lay assistants are equally covered, so I also love you nurse guys and paramedic guys, and basically every decent human being who is willing to help. Thanks for the kind words. I always loved aviation, but poor eyesight led me to get into medicine instead. Safe travels, and hope that flights return to normal sooner rather than later. Retired FA with a 22-year career. Every time I had a medical emergency on board, there happened to be a doctor on board as well. Even though we were trained in CPR, had defibrillators on board, and a liaison with medical personnel available via the cockpit, I was so happy that there were doctors on board who were willing to come forward. Afterthought, no one died. Seriously hope nurses and paramedics aren't considered lay assistants. Recently, before the coronavirus, I was taking an international flight. The flight attendant asked if there was a doctor on board. I was actually asleep, but somehow that woke me up. And I was like, wait, you need a doctor? Turns out a patient was experiencing some diffuse chest pain. Went to examine him, and my inner alarm bells rang when I asked him some questions. I had a very high suspicion that the guy was having an aortic dissection. I told the flight attendant who passed the information to the pilot. The pilot made an emergency landing at a different airport, met with an ambulance. I later called the hospital to find out what exactly it was, and it turns out I was right. If they had carried on, he might not have survived. Oh my goodness, great job! You should feel 10 out of 10 proud of yourself every day for the rest of your life. Thank you. It's a good feeling when you can apply these skills and save lives in the most unexpected situations. Also, not the first case I've had on a plane, but this was definitely the more severe one. My dad survived one of these in 2017, a Type 1A, 8-hour emergency open heart surgery to save his life. In a coma for 4 days, ICU for over a week. The hospital had to call in an outside surgeon that day because all of theirs were in surgery. Dad's surgeon was actually on the highway driving to help his wife with a fundraising event for a local charity. And as it turns out, one of the top cardiovascular surgeons in our city. When Dad woke up, he didn't even remember getting out of bed the morning it happened. He banged on the door yelling for help, and I found him sitting in the hallway clammy and pale. He said it felt like an elephant was sitting on his chest. His tear was so severe it affected his entire aorta, from the top of his aortic arch almost all the way down to his legs. 2 other surgeries to repair the damage to his thoracic and abdominal aorta, and he is as good as new. I am eternally grateful to his medical team for saving his life. Damn, that's some scary stuff, and I'm glad your dad is okay. Don't forget to go get yourself checked. IIRC, the American Heart Association, recommends all first-degree relatives, siblings, children, of individuals with aortic dissections to get screened via echocardiogram. That's an amazing story, and also very classic of how this presents. Tearing, pressure feeling on the chest, pale, clammy, sometimes difference in pulse between the arms. Sometimes the dissection can also go up the neck arteries, carotids, and also affect the blood supply to the brain. I'm glad to hear he was taken well care of. Even if you get to the surgery, there is around a 50% mortality rate on the table. I'm so glad to hear your dad is doing well now. My dad had aortic dissection type B, as the ICU doctor said the best type. Usually no surgery required, just a couple of months ago. He was still in the ICU for a few weeks and thankfully is at home now and doing better now. Not a doctor, but the story is still relevant in an opposite sort of way. Was watching a children's soccer game. 2 11-year-old girls collided. One got up and her arm was hanging 90 degrees down halfway between her wrist and her elbow. It's not supposed to do that. She continued to play for a second and then realized what her arm was doing. She totally bugged out. She started screaming, "I think something is wrong here." All of the parents are yelling at the girl to take a knee and the ref to stop the game. I jump the fence with another parent. We get her to sit on her knee and rest her broken arm against the bent knee. I yell out, "Where's her parents?" Nothing. "Is anyone here a doctor?" Nothing. At this point, it's been like 2 minutes since the original and obvious break. I take my phone out to call 911. 911? Hi, what's your emergency? Me. I'm sure you've gotten multiple calls by now, but I just want to make sure. We've got a girl with a broken arm here. Has anyone called for an ambulance? 911. No one has called. Where are you located? There had to be 500 people watching this game. It was a regional tournament. No doctor, no parent, no one had called 911. About 10 minutes later, the ambulance arrived. Mother arrived at the same time. She had to park a mile away, big tournament, and just finally made it back to the game. Girl gets carted away. The remaining girls somewhat finished the game that had been shortened by 30 minutes due to this incident. Finally, the next game starts and I take my seat on the sidelines next to some random parent. Her husband comes up next to us a few minutes later and she turns to him and says, "You missed all the action. This man," pointing to me, "had to help a girl who broke her arm." "Really?" he says. "That's too bad. I probably could have helped." I turn to him and ask him why that is. "Are you a doctor?" "Yes," he says, "I'm a pediatric orthopedic surgeon." The first doctor to show up when it's too late is the most qualified doctor. I just stared at him for a few minutes, mouth agape. He looked at me sheepishly and just said, "I know, right? Don't feel bad, you probably did the same thing I would have done, but I would have known it was the right thing to do." Lesson of the day. The more people around, the more likely that everyone assumes someone else has called 911. TLDR. Child broke her arm in front of me. A child arm fixer doctor happened to arrive just after she was carted off in an ambulance. Bystander effect. The greater the number of bystanders, the less likely it is that one of them will help. Something about pointing at people if necessary might force them to actually do something. Indeed, a key part of my first aid training was about pointing at someone and calling them out by characteristic. Yelling, "Call an ambulance," is useless because people will assume someone else will do it. Pointing at someone and saying, "Woman in the blue sweater, call an ambulance," will hopefully have the required effect. I was a medical student flying back to start my second year. The flight attendant asks over the PA if there's a doctor on board. Me, having finished my first year of medical school, stays quiet. A few minutes later, the call goes out again to ask if there's a doctor on board. I decide to go and tell the flight attendant that I'm only a medical student going into my second year, and I won't be offended if they say they don't need my services. The flight attendant instead is happy and takes me over to business class, where a woman was just coming to after passing out. In my head, I'm thinking, oh damn, I haven't seen any patients and now they're expecting me to perform. As I'm very nervously checking her vitals, a licensed physician comes over and tells me to keep continuing with the vitals. He gets me to administer oxygen to the patient and assesses her responsiveness, HR, pulse, etc. It turns out she had passed out and was a little anemic after further questioning about her medical history. After we took her back to her seat, the physician explained what the issue was. Then he said he'll do the paperwork that the airline required and I was no longer needed. The plane landed at its destination and I ran off to catch my connecting flight. That's awesome that he guided you through it rather than taking over. Sounds like he made a good teacher. Indeed, it was a good lesson and he said that I was doing well enough for a first-timer, but he wanted to keep watch and take care of the paperwork at the same time. I was flying out of my home airport during my intern year. I'd just finished my cardiology rotation, intensive care. The flight attendant asked for a doctor because a passenger had severe chest pain. It turned out there was also my senior resident and my CCU attending on the same flight, unknown to me. All three of us had worked together for the past 2 months and signed off the CCU the day before. Like a well-oiled machine, we took care of the patient. He was stable, thankfully. An ambulance was waiting for him when we landed, and I was very grateful to have both my senior resident and my attending at the same time. What a coincidence! Also because the most exposure I've had to those terms, resident and attending, is via scrubs. I'm imagining this scene as Dr. Cox, JD and probably Elliot working together on the patient. Cox probably yelling at Janet to pay some effing attention or whatnot. This makes the story even better. I imagine the look on Cox's face as he is attending to the patient as Janet runs up one aisle, exclaiming he's a doctor and here to help, just as Barbie runs up the other and trips over some luggage, falling and hitting the patient or something.